All right, everybody, welcome back. This is the end of the world with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
I'm Stu, and today we are discussing the 1995 smash hit Ebola scare film par excellence, Outbreak, starring the inimitable Dustin Hoffman, the completely unproblematic superstar of the 60s through today, Dustin Hoffman.
In some ways, the inspiration for the entire podcast. I'm not going to lie. As we'll get into, I watched Outbreak when I was a kid, and then it just became one of the, everyone's got those movies that they just end up watching 50 times.
Yeah, we touched on this last week. I mean, for me, it was probably Temple of Doom or Airplane. I watched Airplane. I watched Airplane again probably during COVID, and I found that I knew literally every single beat, still having not seen it in 15 years, and got no enjoyment. It was a very anhedonic experience, but still.
Yeah, no, I had the opposite experience with this movie. It realized that my memory is definitely fading because despite having watched it many times, there were still moments that I had trouble recalling.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't seen it since it came out, or maybe I saw it once since then. I saw it in the theater for sure, and I only remembered some images that were confirmed and then kind of complicated by my actual watching. Oh, it's like, oh, that's where that image is from. That right. Like I had an image of the monkey loose on the plane for some reason. That just does not happen in the film, but. But before we get into all that, why don't we talk about a recent apocalyptic event, namely the Hurricane Helene, which has ravaged the Appalachians. Oddly enough, I'm teaching this environmental lit class right now, and we just finished a unit on Hurricane Katrina last week. So it was like perfect timing in a dark way.
Perfect timing.
Unfortunately, perfect timing where it's like, hey guys, remember that thing we talked about, the destructive power of hurricanes? And well, turns out they are back.
Right, so you just started teaching again.
Well, like a month ago,
Yeah, so this is still pretty fresh. Out of the gates, you've got some fodder.
Oh yeah, and I mean, the timing could not have been more perfect. Like on Thursday we watched the Spike Lee documentary. When the levees broke, and we're kind of discussing the whole Bush era non-response to Katrina, and there's a bit of a is the federal government doing enough to help the denizens of Asheville and surrounding regions? Trump is really getting Elon to spark up.
Trump, king of the effective federal response in our public. Is weighing in from a place of serious experience, not to be trifled with.
Yeah, I mean the mastermind behind the brilliant COVID response.
This is like one of my favorite parts that remains of the Trump the phenomenon is the promise of fixing everything.
Oh yeah,
after having already been president. All it'll take is I'll end wars, I'll end famine, I'll definitely respond to hurricanes better. Just put me back in, coach.
And I'll cure cancer and Alzheimer's and it's like, wait a minute, did we already try this once and none of that happened?
What do you make of the federal response? Because it feels like it's sort of clouded by the election, right? In terms of the politicization of it, obviously by the Republicans, but also like, are the Democrats trying to sort of brush it as best they can under the rug to not make it seem like everything is falling apart in the run up to the election? What do you think?
Well, no, but I don't think so. I mean, I think part of the problem is that this is an area that has not traditionally been affected by hurricanes. It is hundreds of miles inland, right? And what this reveals is something we touched on our extremely popular Trump-Harris debate recap episode. The bane of our listeners, apparently. Unlike the Biden-Trump episode, our most popular episode ever. So there's no telling. Well,
the undeniable star power of Joe Biden.
Yeah, I guess that was the difference maker. But one thing we touched is that, at the end of that debate, they talked about climate for all of 1 second, and the literal last question, and
they did talk about it. They actually talked about manufacturing jobs. How proud they were to bring manufacturing back while somehow really balancing the environmental needs of society.
Yeah, as we touched on, it was extremely ridiculous and utterly unserious. And I was talking to my class today that like this is the new normal, or the new abnormal, as I believe someone recently touted it as, which is to say that initially I was polling the class. I was like, guys, where do you think the areas that are going to be most affected by climate change? And if I asked you, Michael, what would you say? Like, what geographical areas would you?
I mean, obviously, the first notion is the coast.
The coast.
Very coastal parts of it.
Small island countries, the places in the Caribbean, places in,
because everyone has that idea of sea levels rising, and entire areas going, trying to get home insurance in Miami ain't so easy anymore,
Yeah, and when this is appropriate because we'll be discussing where some of these ideas of sea swallowing events next week, and the next 2 weeks, actually, but not to get ahead of ourselves. Yeah, I mean, logically, the coast, the Seychelles, right? Everyone's like, oh, the Seychelles are just going to be swallowed into the Maldives, right? These like Indian Ocean islands. But
some of which are actually part of the last chance tourism phenomenon, right? That we covered.
Yeah, exactly.
Months ago. These beautiful places that are under threat. And sort of the long-term idea that the very coastlines of the world will be rewritten, right?
Yeah, exactly. But in point of fact, actually, some of the most endangered places are mountainous areas. One of the most endangered countries in the world that you wouldn't think of is in fact Pakistan, which is not really, it has a coast, but it's primarily a mountainous region. But what you come to learn is that flooding, because of excessive rainfall and if glacial melt, mountainous melt runoff, it has the capacity to utterly devastate a country that's pretty much inland, like Pakistan. So like what we're seeing in North Carolina in the Asheville Ozark Mountain, or what is it? Appalachian Mountain, like Ozarks are a little further, but this is in keeping with that, right? So it makes you realize that like the implications of climate change are much broader than you might initially assume. And the utter unseriousness of the government, societies, the cultures, I mean, it's quite dire. It's in fact, we're further along on the doomsday clock of climate change than anyone is really willing to reckon with, is my sense of things.
Right. And I think that sort of culturally, we're seeing sort of the overall impact, sort of writ large, of a climate sort of trumped up or otherwise of crisis that's been existing, let's say loosely since 9/11, right? And we exist in this atmosphere. Some of it is legitimate, and ironically, the more legitimate the crisis, the less we seem to pay attention, and the more fabricated the crisis, the more we tend to deal with, quote unquote, right? And so this overall atmosphere, I think, creates this very unfortunate reality where all of this tragedy and all of this suffering is considered sort of de facto. I mean, whether it's a genocide or a war on a sovereign nation, right? Or corporate calamity, oil spills, any number of crises that are just sort of considered part of existence now. And so when you get to a hurricane like this, the reaction that you have to Katrina, which, I guess was more sensational in a certain sense, in terms of the way it played out and the sort of like very clear and present lack of a federal response, versus the sort of long-term lack of a federal response that leads to areas like the ones you're talking about being incredibly endangered by weather and climate events. And now it just feels like we're just along for the ride of decline, right? I mean, that's sort of the sense that you get, that nothing like this could actually be fixed. to the point where, yeah, like we said, in a presidential debate, this is a complete non-issue. These things are complete non-issues. And I'm sure we'll hear about it in tomorrow's. It'll be fascinating to see how this crisis is addressed in tomorrow's VP debate. I'm sure it'll just be about federal government response and the lack thereof, and Walz trying to defend. But yeah, that to me is the great tragedy of all of this, is that it's sort of built into the cost of business, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Give me an example of one of the, when you said, we spend an infinite amount of time dealing with like non-serious threats, and like the more actually serious threat is, the first thing I could think of was like, are the vaccines magnetizing people or whatever? And there's like 10 explainer articles and like, no, in fact, like there is no magnetic element in the vaccine for COVID, or right. Like these kind of like trumped up.
But it also gets down to like the even more trivial, right? Of like, the competition of like trans athletes.
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Everything is presented. These complete non-issues are presented as sort of like serious moments of crisis that are indicative of this greater civilizational collapse. And again, those get more airtime than things like climate change.
Like the internet, what is it called? The intellectual dark web kind of caused celebs. The Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand.
Cultural Marxism. All right.
Yeah.
It's in every single aspect of the way that we talk about things, we apply this crisis language. And
what kind of books are in libraries? As if anyone is reading any books.
That's right. Let's not talk about the real problem that no one's going to libraries anymore. Yeah. There's no fun libraries. Let's actually talk about, the books that teach, what is it they claim, 87 genders and stuff like this. And so like all of these issues, if they're all treated with the same language, the power structure then gets to pick and choose not just what to highlight, but by doing so, actually what to ignore. And then it comes sort of right out in the open, and people's houses are floating down downtown Asheville, right?
Yeah, no, it's grim.
And it's not to make light of this. I mean, this is like a true disaster for these people.
Absolutely. It's horrible.
Right. And so now, though, we get into this idea of reset and rebuild, and we're going to donate, and we're going to try to help, bring back these places.
Do you think they're going to do a concert for Asheville or whatever?
That's right.
Are they going to get Bruce Springsteen?
Again, not to sell these people out and say they just should have a home, but
no, of course not.
If you're not going to have an underpinning of sort of combating these problems, yeah, you're just going to keep rebuilding and destroying and rebuilding until it's too late, right?
No, I agree. But speaking of destroying a town, that is one of the themes. An
unwittingly perfect segue.
One of the themes of 1995's Outbreak, directed by Wolfgang Petersen, the director of Das Boot, an actually good movie. The Never-Ending Story, also kind of good but very weird movie. Air Force One and Troy, one of the all-time great German Hollywood film directors, Petersen. And Outbreak, this is mid-90s, kind of quintessential conspiratorial disaster. American military is bad. X-Files, post-JFK. We'll get into all of this.
And of the time where it's like solid budget to just get huge cast involved.
Giant cast loaded with superstars. It's not just
Dustin Hoffman. You've got Morgan Freeman, you've got, again, the perfectly unproblematic Kevin Spacey, Rene Russo, Donald Sutherland plays the evil general.
Yeah,
a lot to talk about. But you surround these very simple storylines with these huge names, and people flood out to the theaters to see it, right?
Yeah, and I think like this movie is weird because it's a classic end of history movie. So there's no longer the Russian threat. Instead, the threat has to be internal. It's the deep state is the threat in this movie. And it's also post-AIDS, like AIDS epidemic was the last 15 years before this. And it almost feels like this movie is looking for like a worse AIDS. And that worse AIDS is Ebola, right?
Yeah.
And it reminded me, of course, of the great New York Ebola scare of 2014, where a doctor returned from Africa, having been, working there on a big outbreak, helping people, unwittingly infected, spent a day just going around New York City. And I mentioned last
when you're in town, right? Even if you got Ebola,
well, he's from here. He lives here.
Oh, is he? Okay.
And he still lives here.
I thought he was like going to the Seinfeld restaurant or something.
No, he was just going about his normal social life. He went to the gutter in Williamsburg, and I said I had a near miss. I think I had been at the gutter the night before.
Oh, yes.
The night before his fateful trip, and I was in a bowling league at the time. I was there every Monday, and I think my dates might be wrong on this, but I think he was there like the Tuesday after. So it was just like a near miss. And I'll never forget, they closed the gutter for a week. They had to spray it down and disinfect. No one there got sick. Like, he infected no one in New York. There was no actual Ebola outbreak. But my friends who are on the bowling team with them have a mom who's a little bit paranoid. So she didn't want them using the rented bowling shoes anymore. So she just bought them brand new, beautiful bowling shoes that they could bring.
And I can't say I wouldn't have acted somewhat similar in that moment.
I did not care. I continued to use the rented bowling shoes, and
that's the difference between you and I.
That's true. I was fine. But, Ebola is this kind of scary, I think scary just because of its manifestation, right? No one wants to have their eyes bleed out and their organs liquefy. But in this film, it's actually not even just Ebola, it's super Ebola. It is Motaba, which is
the dreaded Motaba.
Yeah, this fictionalized hemorrhagic fever. Another thing I love about this, the hero of the film, Dustin Hoffman, Colonel Sam Daniels, is a U.S. AMRID doctor. And, U.S.
So what's AMRID?
U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, best known in modern times as the employer of one Bruce Ivins, the suspected anthrax attacker. This is the wing of the military that deals with infectious diseases. And the anthrax that was circulating after 9/11, you remember a bunch of postal workers and staffers for senators got sick. A bunch of people died right after 9/11. Very scary.
I'm sure we'll be doing an episode on the anthrax moment.
God, what a crazy story. Have you ever? I mean, I won't spoil it, but I mean that story is nuts. In any case. So that's where I know U.S. AMRID for. But in this film, they're heroes. They're not poisoning anything. And, the film centers around the doomed love between Colonel Daniels and his ex-wife, Robbie Keogh, who is, they're breaking up. She's moving out. She's taking a new job at the CDC. She used to work with him, but it's all over.
Taking the dogs.
She's taking the dogs. He's heartbroken. A lot of pet stuff in this movie I found kind of interesting. The pet dog motif comes back. The pet monkey. Good.
Which ends up solving the whole.
Yeah, thank God for that pet monkey. But the movie opens. They're splitting up, but Daniels is sent with his team, which includes Kevin Spacey as Casey, who's very weird. He has a weird reddish blonde dye job in the film.
Yeah, he's really mailing it in, Spacey, here, because he's at that point. It's totally beneath him to do a movie like this.
I don't know. No, I think you're wrong. This is the same year as Usual Suspects. But
that's a great movie. This is just
actually, you know what? It's actually not a great movie. It's a whack movie. We won't ever do it because there's no. Maybe we'll figure out a way to do it. But
Usual Suspects, it's probably time to shut down the podcast.
No. The end of the world is everywhere, Michael. We can find that kernel of doom in anything. It's an okay movie. I think it's a little overhyped at this point. No, I think the point with Spacey is that, and I think I'm borrowing from possibly the Michael and Us podcast, but someone pointed out that Kevin Spacey was actually never a good actor. He's actually not a good actor, but this weird mythology around him emerged primarily because of Usual Suspects, and then American Beauty, which is a terrible movie. I mean, talk about apocalypse. That is the end of taste and hope in America. I mean, it's kind of effective, but it's so corny. And I loved it when it came out. I was like, oh my God, this movie is like the poem that I wish I could write. You know, now I watch it, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to be ill.
Bags flying around. Remember that?
The bag. Yeah,
that's how deep he is. He's filming bags. He's out here filming bags.
We're at the next level. In any case, Cuba Gooding Jr. is the third member of their team. He's the new guy. He knows everything in theory, but has never done it in practice. He's very nervous, but he ends up being great and heroic. They go to Africa. There's a shaman in the. I mean, it's just like, what are we doing here?
The things that you used to be able to do in these movies. I mean, really.
It's pretty grim.
Up on the hill, there's smoke signals. They do the whole thing.
Yeah. It's just those sections
and totally pointless. They're just like, just so they can be like, he knows that trouble's coming or whatever. Right.
Right. They claim that the shaman blames the outbreak on clear cutting of the forest, which in a sense is true because it drives animals into contact with people where they wouldn't. But,
that's right.
You know, the Cuba sees the villagers with their eyes, you know, bleeding out or whatever and freaks. He tears off his mask. You're like, oh, that's it for Cuba, R.I.P. But luckily, this version of Motaba is not airborne. It's fine. They're not going to get sick.
Got to contain. Just contain.
But he goes back and he's like, we got to get a warning out. This is the worst sickness I've ever seen. And his boss, Morgan Freeman, who's the general in charge of USAMRIID, is like, nah, let's, you know. And immediately we know something's going on here. Oh, right. I forgot to mention, the movie opens with them firebombing a village where Motaba has been discovered in the 60s. Which just, in case we were wondering, like, yes, the U.S. government knows about Motaba, has it, is developing it to use as a biological weapon. They have a cure for it, and they want to keep its existence under wraps because if, you know, it gets out there, the Chinese or whoever can work on a cure themselves and be ready for our insidious, evil biological attack. Which, you know, has the U.S. government done stuff like this? Undoubtedly. I feel like there's a little bit of like AIDS the AIDS conspiracy theories were big around this time, like the US government actually made AIDS. Not true. I mean, samples of AIDS have been found from decades and decades ago before it ever reached the United States. It's not something the government controlled. There was a big conspiracy movement about that. But as I said, it's this JFK, X-Files, the evil government, but luckily that can be brought down by Fox Mulder, or in this case, Dustin Hoffman, Sam Daniels. You know, all it takes to defeat the deep state is one good man in a position of action. Government, you know, the general, we see Morgan Freeman, General Ford, as he's called, calling up to his boss, who is the sinister Donald Sutherland. Playing the inverse, one of the great recently departed Canadian actors, of course, Donald Sutherland, a relative of one of Canada's premier socialists, interestingly. I'm forgetting what his name is. I can't remember off the top. I should have looked this up before. But yeah, he's got good NDP like ties. Oh, really? Yeah, because there's a funny thing where Kiefer is like like, why is Kiefer Sutherland memorializing a socialist? Wait, Jack Bowers? Jack Bowers a commie?
Was it Jack Layton?
I don't know.
They related? Oh, maybe. Well, we'll run it through our fact-checking department.
Yeah, I'll add a note at the end of the episode that clears all of this up. But again, hat tip to the Michael and Us podcast for alerting me to this. In any case, we see a monkey get captured that's going to be used for biological testing, and this monkey is then the agent of all the trouble that follows, because we see it get imported on this ship. It gets taken to this lab. This character, played by Patrick Dempsey, Jimbo, is like taking lab animals and selling them to a pet shop. Like,
make it quick.
I've got. Why? What's that?
Why wouldn't you make a quick buck?
Yeah, but I mean, like, how lucrative of a side hustle is this?
Right. Like, how much is this like very low end pet shop that he goes to actually purchasing this monkey?
He's like, oh yeah, that monkey is $18,000. Do you think like local villager Marge is going to be like shelling that out for the? doesn't seem too likely to me.
But he can't even sell it, right? Because it's not the right gender.
Right. He's like, oh no,
Bob. Not the right gender.
Yeah.
Not the right sex.
Yeah. The monkey identifies in the wrong way. Right. It's a girl monkey, and the guy who buys the monkeys wanted a boy because he's already got, and like they already have another monkey for sale in the, which is like.
Gets off to a very facile start.
Right? I mean, there used to be monkeys in pet shops like in the 60s. My mom's mother had a pet monkey briefly, like in Pittsburgh in the 1960s. Yeah, I was like, what happened to the monkey? She's like, oh, it got mean. I'm like, and? She's like, I don't know. It just, one day it wasn't there anymore. I'm like, okay. Can you imagine a monkey in like a small suburban Pittsburgh house? Like,
sure.
In the 60s, you're like trying to watch the Beatles and the monkey's like, in front of the screen. Anyway, but yeah, this feels like very ridiculous. Before Rudy, the pet shop owner, rejects the monkey, but is scratched by it. The monkey is mean, and this is bad for Rudy. Jimbo is like going to set the monkey free. He's like, well, no one wants to buy you, so I'll just
gives up. I guess there's one pet store in the world that you can kind of sell. So the one turns it down. He's like, what about complete freedom for the monkey? Actually,
why don't we just put the monkey into the woods of Northern California?
What could go wrong?
That seems safe and fine. While they're driving,
you can see whoever fucking wrote or made this movie just being like, how the fuck did we get to the containment? How the fuck did we get to the military quarantine? It's like, who gives a shit? Just have him throw the monkey into the fucking woods. Let's just get going.
Well, and it's not even the monkey that like causes that, right? It's it's the fact that the monkey scratched Rudy, the pet shop owner, and then the monkey just is out there to be found later because it's like the MacGuffin that has the cure. The monkey also spits some water, conveniently landing directly in Jimbo's mouth while Jimbo's like driving it to set it free.
Yeah, he's just annoyed at Jimbo. The monkey's just annoyed at Jimbo, so just throws some spit at him.
Yeah, like, Jimbo's like,
as monkeys are wont to do.
And then conveniently, Jimbo gets on a flight after setting the monkey free and flies to Boston. This is another scene that I remember with him, Patrick Dempsey, whose whole look in this is so deranged. Jimbo's like got a goatee and like he looks terrible. This is like one of the handsomest men in the world who just in this film looks completely horrible. Right. He gets on a plane and he's like dying. And
it looks even worse once he gets on the flight.
Yeah, he's literally like, and like a little kid's like, are you going to eat your cookie? His like bite taken out of cookie. And he's like, no, chief, it's all yours, sheriff, or whatever. And the mom, and then his mom's like, leave the nice man alone, Jimbo, or like Bobby or whatever. And Jimbo's just like, it's fine. And she's like, get him out of here. Gets off the plane in Boston. And one thing I love about this movie is like, there's like germ view, and there's also like we go into like the character's perspective as they're like dying or as they
it's all spinny.
It's just like how much
give you an idea of just how serious Mataba is. Yeah. If the hemorrhaging didn't do it for you.
He like drops immediately. He gets off the plane conveniently into his girlfriend's arm. They kiss and he immediately collapses. And within a day, he's dead. Girlfriend's dead. CDC, Rene Russo, who this was like perfect era Rene Russo, right? I mean, In the Line of Fire, I think Petersen also directed In the Line of Fire. Maybe wrong about that. Great movie. Better movie, I would argue. But Rene Russo is just like the kind of ideal of like a early middle-aged beautiful woman in this era, and I think she looks great in this, and the fact that she's married to Dustin Hoffman makes perfect sense. Well, anyway,
you have to understand they both love disease. So
what else brings people together? Like
classic, like your mind turns me on, right?
It's a sapiosexual relationship, as I believe that is called. Immediately, like Rudy drops dead, and then like knocks over. He like drops a bunch of like aquariums in his fall, and like the other captured monkey is like, like it's just like he's taken to the hospital, and a guy's testing his blood, and like an idiot, he like reaches into the blood tester while the tube is spinning around.
There's a lot of malfunctions. Even Dustin Hoffman briefly, there's like
a tear in his suit.
Almost goes in with a tear. This is what eventually gets Kevin Spacey. He's really tired, so his suit gets torn. Everyone's fucking up. Robbie ends up getting it eventually.
She pricks herself with a needle, gives herself
right. It's a great testament to the sheer ineffective nature of the CDC, and boy, does it ring true all these years later.
Yikes! Yeah. The blood spatters on this lab tech, and they're like, you're fine. Don't worry about it.
It's just blood, just a bit of blood.
He goes to the movies, and that's when we get the germ view of just like him coughing and like little pustules floating into the laughing mouths of the other theater goers. It's just like a truly hilarious use of. I mean, how much do you think those shots cost to do in 1995? Like $1 million each, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just like,
and like the director's just like, we'll spare no expense to get the aquarium shot,
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. So then we have our main plot, which is that there is an outbreak in this little town, Cedar Creek, which has 2,800 and something inhabitants. Yeah. And from what we can tell, like basically all of them are just like infected pretty much. And the whole city is quarantined. The military shows up because this is what happened when COVID started, right? Like the army just showed up and like quarantined New Rochelle. No, I mean, as we know from our experience, the idea that you could effectively quarantine a highly contagious airborne sickness to one town is ridiculous. But, the version that Jimbo brought to Boston conveniently kills no one except his girlfriend, whom he kissed, right? Wasn't airborne then. It only mutated once it got from Rudy into the lab tech.
Right. But they have this great moment, right, where Robbie, who's in charge of the response, it's just like, well, it's not airborne. So as long as no one's sick in 24 hours, we're going to be fine. And then there's this great scene where everyone is getting sick and Robbie doesn't realize this and thinks it's all over, and they have this big celebration at the CDC where papers go flying. Everyone's so
champagne
happy.
Corks.
Yeah. just when the champagne goes off, they get a fax, and guess what? There's trouble.
So, for whatever reason, General Ford does not want to send Sam, his best guy, to Cedar Creek. Instead, he's going to send him to New Mexico to deal with a hantavirus outbreak. Of course. Which is, I love hantavirus. Great reference in The Simpsons. I think there's a box of Crustios that is infected with spiders carrying the hantavirus or something. I don't remember the specific reference, but that's all I could think of. Yeah, but Sam, you know what he does? He goes rogue. He goes to Cedar Creek anyway because it's the right thing to do. And this is
like the great thing of like the movie is about this overwhelmingly powerful and corrupted and dark and sinister U.S. military. But then all he has to do to be able to get to Cedar Creek is just go up to some, like the guy who's in charge of sending the flights out and just be like, my boss says I'm going somewhere else now. I'm actually going to Cedar Creek. And he's like, really? Are you? And it's like, put the phone down. Don't ask your boss. Just put me on the.
I'll have your stripes if you don't send me to. He's like, okay, right. I mean, it's great. This omnipotent, incredibly evil, secretive U.S. military that at the same time is utterly unable to stop Dustin Hoffman. Right.
Yeah.
And all he has to do is just tell a couple fibs, and he
actually does this twice. There's two different moments when he needs an air vehicle, an air vessel, and he just tells somebody his boss told him it was okay. And that's because you follow orders. Although you don't actually, I guess, right?
Well, if you're an Eichmann, you follow orders. But if you're a hero, like
if you're a Hoffman,
right? It's ridiculous. So Cedar Creek is a nightmare. There's a bunch of extraneous scenes. I feel like the movie really loses steam when we like start following the mother who's infected and these other right. There's like these, like the mother's like,
I don't think this thing loses steam for 1 second, but to each their own.
Okay. I found the middle a little.
She has to leave her family, right?
And they want to hug her, but the dad's like, "No, stay away, mommy." Mommy's like, "I'll be back later tonight or whatever."
Make sure you brush your teeth.
Yeah.
Just such a mom, even when she's about to have her organs split open from the inside in the next 16 minutes, she's like, take care of your oral hygiene,
Right. And now that this outbreak is confirmed and it's airborne, Donald Sutherland just goes to the president and is like, look, we've got to nuke the town. Right. Yeah. We've got to just.
And he's got General McClintock has his own agenda, which is to preserve this biological weapon.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the president, Operation Clean Sweep, a very subtle. No one's going to be able to figure out what that means.
Operation Firebomb is.
Right. So and then probably my favorite scene in the whole movie is it's a great character actor. I can't remember who it is, but he plays, I guess, the chief of staff.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And he gives this weirdly contradictory, nonsensical call to the rest of the war room. Where he pulls out the U.S. Constitution, and it's basically like, if we're gonna kill all these fucking people, it better be goddamn worth it,
Yeah, it's so confusing. He's he has a copy of the Constitution, and yet
look at this. You ever heard of this?
I don't see anywhere in this where it says we can wipe out the whole village of Cedar Creek.
Right.
And yet we're gonna. You're just
and yet we may just have to.
Right. And exactly. I mean, you're right. It's so contradictory. And Donald Sutherland is so gung ho. He's like, we are at war. Everyone is at war. And it's like the Cold War is over, and now the war is just to keep hegemonic power by means of biological weapons.
The thought I had watching it this time, I can't remember, what year A Few Good Men came out.
Earlier, I think 91.
And I feel like McClintock and Sutherland, if not Sutherland, because I think he kind of also mails it in a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
The character, I think the writers are thinking they're going to do a Nicholson, right? Nicholson, it's you're goddamn right, I ordered the code red, right? This is what we have to do.
You want the truth, you can't handle the truth.
Right.
Yeah.
But in this movie, the stakes make no sense, that it's this imagined potential long-term enemy that would require this biological weapon allows him to bring America to the brink of complete destruction by this virus, all to potentially eventually fight this war with this super weapon, right?
It makes very little sense.
Right, so he's trying to say those pithy things that Nicholson nails in A Few Good Men, where it's just we're always at war, and it's well, we actually aren't right now.
Yeah,
in the war in this movie, we're fully not actually. Right.
He's we're at war, and the virus is the enemy, but we also want to keep the virus. There's a lot of these confusing mixed messages. It's also at this point that the movie kind of switches into chase mode, where Dustin Hoffman, General McClintock is Donald Sutherland is arrest Sam, we've got to get him, and this is where the movie shifts into, and I do remember this experience when I was younger as well, where it shifts into, if not deliberately, the comic, right? It becomes a comedy, I think. It's certainly, if you treat it like a comedy, it becomes very enjoyable, because now, so Dustin Hoffman believes he has located the monkey, because he also takes over a newsroom. Well, hold on. It's so convoluted. He flies to the records office where the naval records are kept, and he determines which ship came from Africa to drop off animals.
Just to be clear, he's flown from the site of the quarantine.
They've stolen a helicopter to do this. And then
by saying their boss said it was fine.
And then by General McClintock has put it out on the wire that they have Motaba and are, these dangerous...
Which is great, too, because when they get to the records office, they're very crowded by a bunch of people who also want records.
Yeah, the records office is just jammed. Everyone needs to know.
And Cuba Gooding Jr. gets them to back away by being we're from Cedar Creek, California, the home of the virus. And everyone's you should go to the front of the line. We don't want to be anywhere near you.
Yeah, and then the workers, the government workers at the office are just Oh yeah,
how can we help?
Yeah, I can help. I can figure this out. Get Charlotte.
That's a lot of boxes you're gonna have to go through.
Yeah. All right, so they find it. Then they fly to the ship itself to learn that they've got a dead guy who's no one on the ship speaks English. There's a Chinese he's Korean. A South Korean ship worker has died, and they go to his bunk and find a photo of him with
a Polaroid
with him, and conveniently, because if that was a negative,
and thankfully it was the right monkey, because I think if you're putting Polaroids of monkeys on your wall, who knows how many Polaroids of how many monkeys you're putting up.
Right. When was that Polaroid from? Is there a date on it?
Right.
But in any case,
he just senses this is the monkey for sure.
And it's a capuchin monkey. It's very cute. It's later named by a little girl, Betsy. They somehow, then they go to the TV station. I mean, there's so many steps here. And then Dustin Hoffman, they walk in
again, somehow the military can't locate or track down or get these people.
Well, we see control. A scene of the cops coming just as they're flying away after they've commandeered the airwaves.
Right. One would think, given the way the movie ends, they could have gotten there a little bit sooner, right?
Right. Then they make an announcement saying,
he's holding the Polaroid on television, which I guess just also goes to everyone.
Everyone is watching at that moment, including the mother of this little girl who's been playing with the monkey that's in the woods.
And formed a relationship with the monkey. She's in love with the monkey.
They go to her house because she immediately calls, and that call is relayed to them, even though they're rogue in a helicopter without a cell phone. It's very confusing. They go to her house. Cuba Gooding Jr.
This would be like the ultimate episode of The Newsroom, I think, right? Where Dustin Hoffman and Cuba Gooding Jr.
commandeer
Jeff Daniels' newsroom, and Jeff Daniels is like, "By God, we reported the news today."
They commandeer. They capture the monkey. There's a great. Is Cuba Gooding Jr.'s shot gonna hit the? He has a tranquilizer dart. Where did that come from? They just have it, and they get it, and he calls in to General McClintock.
You think movie over, right? They've solved it. Now they're going to run.
But no.
Extra layer to this.
General McClintock wants to clean sweep to go ahead. He wants to nuke the town, and what's more, he wants to kill Dustin Hoffman. He's following him in 2 Apache attack helicopters, and they're in a little Vietnam style single.
Because again, McClintock needs to save the virus as a biological
for this hypothetical war against this enemy that we'll figure that out later. I mean, as if there are no other viruses that they could as if this is so singular that there's a long chase sequence. They get away because they fake a crash by shooting some missiles, which their small helicopter also has missiles for some reason.
Just a couple missiles.
Each missile probably costs, $80 million or something. Meanwhile, as you said, Robbie has been infected by accidentally pricking herself. Casey, Kevin Spacey himself, has been infected. Casey dies, right?
So scared.
Kind of unceremoniously, right? He just kind of drops dead, and isn't mentioned at the end or anything.
No.
It's not like, oh, we lost Casey, there's not even a mention of his passing. But he gets back, he gets the monkey, they synthesize a cure, and Rene Russo is starting to have some eye bleeding. She's not looking so hot.
Time is running out. Will they synthesize in time?
And they do. They inject her. Also, McClintock is still.
What ends up happening, right, is that the chase then turns where they're being chased, right? And now at the last, they are the ones doing the chasing because they realize that they're still going to bomb Cedar Creek.
Yeah.
So now they're chasing the bomber, and now they line up with the bomber. Somehow he's such a good pilot, Cuba Gooding Jr., who we didn't even know was a pilot. Not only is he a world-class scientist, he's also the greatest goddamn helicopter pilot you've ever seen, right? But he's also at first like, I don't know if I can fly through fog, sir, but then he's able to balance his helicopter so perfectly on this trajectory with the bomber. And Dustin Hoffman gives this plea to humanity that's also going out to the military, Central Command, to McClintock, Morgan Freeman, and obviously Morgan Freeman, Ford, he's having a crisis of conscience, but he can't relay this because he's just a humble servant of McClintock, the great general, right? And they're like, eye to eye, the helicopter and the bomber. And
it's a chicken game, right? Like,
yeah, and they start playing chicken, and he's yelling at Billy. He learns the first name of the pilot of the
right. And even if
he's like, Billy, this is your testimony to life right now. This is the decision. We're not moving, right?
Well, and even if like if for some reason if the bomber changes its trajectory at all, the mission has to be called off. It can't like fly up slightly and still drop this bomb that will destroy.
That's right. I guess once you put a bomber like that just on course, it can't move or just flies into like a fucking cliff. Like, so weird.
Makes no sense, but still.
They play chicken, and obviously Billy's conscience wins out in the end, and he dodges Hoffman at the last, and then kind of makes up a reason.
And then Morgan Freeman, General Ford, his conscience triumphs, and because General McClintock is like, back to base, reload, a second run, they drop the bomb off the coast. Another, like, why did you have to drop the bomb at all? I don't understand. Like, couldn't you just land with it and use it against this hypothetical
just to visually
enemy?
show the viewer how close it came to Cedar Creek.
Yeah, it's just like this huge explosion off the.
Luckily, in the water.
Yeah, I'm sure no marine life was harmed by that.
No.
Or there were no fishermen or anything. But never mind. And then Morgan Freeman arrests, Donald Sutherland, General McClintock, and the colonel who Sutherland has been abusing the whole time is the one who gets to have the last laugh, and he gets his gun out and he takes him away to the brig or whatever. And then the movie ends like incredibly quickly. He goes back. We see a little syringe mark on his arm because he took off his mask when he was giving the cure to Rene Russo.
They get the cure so quickly.
They get the cure. The cure works immediately.
Yeah,
it's like 5 minutes later, Rene Russo's like, "Wow, what a weird dream." It's like,
wow, that's some really good synthesis. Yeah, Cuba Gooding must be so tired after flying a helicopter for a day.
And then just like whipping up a miracle cure for this new deadly hyper-Ebola. Yeah. And the whole town is saved, and they are reconciled. Their divorce, it's a remarriage. They're getting back together.
One has to assume that Daniels becomes president or something after this.
Yeah, I mean, this is heroics, the likes of which we have not seen ever. And I mean, like, it's a ridiculous film. It's classic 90s blockbuster. As I said, I think it's kind of like, that, I mean, this movie had a huge impact, though. Like, I was afraid of Ebola forever. Yeah. And I think this movie put Ebola on the map as like.
I mean, I think you could draw a pretty straight line from Outbreak as a child through to my long-term hypochondria that has been impacting me every day the rest of my life,
Like, this is where it all came from.
And they say movies can't change anything.
Right. They say art has no power.
Yes. I give you Outbreak, Exhibit A.
Yeah.
But I was asking you before, this is a very bleak picture of the U.S. military. I mean, obviously, McClintock takes over as the true evil. But for much of the movie, Freeman, General Ford.
He's just going along with it.
Yeah, but since 1967.
This is like 30 years of just, we have this deadly disease.
And to go back to another movie where the military plays a role, Arrival, our very first episode, is it while they do get in the way, it is a little more cumbersome and they're complicated and China's involved and they've got to ward off all of the fog of war that's happening. This is very upfront that the U.S. military is this evil institution that will take serious steps against its own citizens.
And that's why I come back to JFK, right? And
so do you think that that's still would get made? Like if you're making Outbreak now, you know,
certainly if you're making a right-wing movie and you're depicting the deep state in the kind of post-Trumpian QAnon kind of lens, definitely. But from a lib perspective,
this is kind of like a liberal Hollywood.
Yeah, I don't think. I think that no. I mean, I think you're right. Yeah. I think in the lib mindset since COVID, especially, like I believe science. In this house we believe science. We believe blah blah blah. Just that whole kind of. Yeah, I think that's quite different. And
so what's the point?
I mean, I think you even see this
the JFK, like the JFK similarity. Like, what do you?
Well, I just think his character, he plays Mr. X in JFK, who's the guy who gives Garrison, he gives Garrison the whole explanation of the conspiracy.
You're close, Jimbo. Yeah. You're close, Jimbo. Real close.
Yeah, exactly. And this is just that same character, but he's evil instead of doing good. It's just he's just the other side of the mirror. It's like. But I think
the one thing it goes to show that, having been through our own pandemic, that we got off real easy. The CDC and military were obviously very close to making some very tough decisions. The grace of God and Trump, the response obviously clear. And only 1 million people or so died.
And counting. I would say that the other thing is, just to go back to your earlier point, like, we're in a weird stage of liberalism where, like, the FBI are venerated and are the good guys. Remember like just the Mueller she wrote of it all. Like, right, and the actually, the heroic members of law enforcement. Whereas, like
now the Democratic nominee is running on being a cop, essentially.
Yeah, which is a funny inversion because obviously the Law and Order stuff was the kind of bread and butter of the Reagan Southern strategy. And I guess with Clinton, it sort of pivoted in that direction.
But again, to go back to the very beginning of what we were talking about with the hurricane, it's like it's interesting to see that both sides now present very literal forms of crisis management. So it's either, deportation and taking down of the left-wing media and academia and the censorship and all that, or the Democrat side of the prosecution of evil and,
the prosecution of Trump, right? I mean, right. And of the January 6th rioters and of the...
And everything's on the line. And so we need a cop who, to come in and do her own version of cleaning house, right?
Yeah. No, it's a strange world, and
but also, like, by the way, she'll also take care of climate change. ... Don't ask any questions.
Yeah, it's wild. All right, well, I think that's good for Outbreak. And the next 2 weeks, as I alluded to at the beginning, are our
first ever two-parter.
Our first ever official two-parter. I mean, we're going to do a second episode on The Leftovers eventually. We did a part.
3 on that.
Well, a second and a third part. But this is going to be 2 in a row, and we are tackling one of the great disaster narratives of all time. Next week, we'll be focusing on the Platonic vision of Atlantis. That's right. Atlantis. And so we'll be getting into the origins, what Plato had to say about it, what possible historical events Plato may have been thinking about, whether this is a true story, it's not, or whether it's an allegory designed to prove his...
Let's wait until the end of the second part to decide if it's true or not.
Okay. And then the second part will be on the many modern iterations of Atlantis, beginning in America in the 1800s with Ignatius Donnelly and all that.
Very excited for this.
I am too.
And then after that, we will pivot to election coverage.
We've got a couple big election episodes before the fateful day of November 5th, a day on which our podcast will be releasing an episode specifically tuned to the election, of course, and we're very excited for that. But until then, if you would like to follow, please subscribe to the podcast. Follow us on Instagram at The End of the World WMS. And leave us a review if you're feeling so inclined. We always like to get those. And love reviews, rating, whatever it takes. But until next time, this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
I'm Stu, and we'll talk to you real soon.